smelled so good. It smelled like a forest floor. It smelled of the promise of the next harvest. And it was so fertile that plants just popped out of it and grew like crazy. And that's in the pretty abysmal Russian summers that were short and rainy and cold.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus Magazine, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, we're joined by Lina Zeldovich. Lina is a colleague of mine at Nautilus. She's the editor of our Biology and Beyond channel, published with the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Her recent book is The Other Dark Matter, which was about the science and business of turning waste into wealth and health. Lina has written for like the BBC, Smithsonian Magazine, Newsweek, and others. Lina is joining us today to talk a recent story entitled "We Only Think We Waste Products That Come Back to Haunt Us." Lina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Lina, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your background? How did you become interested in science writing and journalism?
Um, that's a really long story. But I guess the short of it is that I was born and raised in a very scientific family. I was born and raised in the Soviet Union. My parents were scientists until they became dissidents because they decided that they disagreed with the Soviet regime. But nonetheless, after that, their science careers went down the drain, and for 18 years they were the Soviet refuseniks. Nonetheless, I still grew up with a lot of science journals and magazines in our house, and my childhood stories were about volcanoes and black holes, and usually told to me by my father, who was a physicist, used to be a physicist. Um, and I guess all this fascination eventually led to me doing science journalism here at Columbia in New York. That's a really short recap of about 30 years.
A brief summary of the recent piece you wrote for us for readers who might not have actually read the piece yet.
Sure. So the story was told we only think we flush it away, and was basically about the deceptive convenience of our toilet systems. So our toilets make waste disappear with incredible efficiency and ease, and it seems that once you push that button, it all goes away, out of sight and out of mind. But the reality is that so much of that what we flush comes back to us, like a toxic tsunami of sorts. And it's just that that tsunami does not swell in our bathrooms, but it does endanger us and out there, in the world. There's a tremendous amount of chemicals in our sewage, a lot of which are not destroyed or deactivated by sewage treatment plants. Sewage treatment plants treat primarily for pathogens, and not everywhere, by the way. But they don't eliminate pharmaceuticals like antibiotics, antidepressants, or anti inflammatory drugs, or caffeine. We humans send loads of caffeine into waterways, and there is such a thing as a lethal dose of caffeine for humans. It's like huge, and it rarely happens that somebody overloads in caffeine. It did happen, by the way, a few times in history. But no one knows what's a little dose for aquatic species, for example. So poorly treated sewage kills fish, destroys corals, fuels toxic algae blooms, and so on. And then there are also things like forever chemicals like PFAS. So we rely on our ocean for so many things that we just can't keep flushing all this stuff into it.
What were your first thoughts on how to go about reporting this story? Where did you want to look first or talk to first?
So Kevin Berger, a Nautilus editor-in-chief, and I first dreamt out this story as a feature story, kind of like loosely titled America's Portrait in Wastewater. And kind of like about what's in our sewage and what it tells us about ourselves as a society. So I write mostly feature stories. So I always think of when I'm reporting a story, I always think of characters, settings, color, scenery, and all that stuff. But this story just kind of wouldn't lend itself to all these qualities. Just keeps it kept coming to me as just a bunch of facts, and they couldn't, make it congeal into a feature story. It really looked like a listicle, and there's sort of a mantra among people who write features a long form, like listicle. Ugh, like not another one of those ways to lose weight by 5 p.m. Like nobody wants to write them, right? Um, but I couldn't quite figure out how to tell it otherwise. So I talked to Kevin, and we decided that it's actually a good idea to write a really smart and educational listicle, which is what we finally did, listing like every chemical that we know and what it does to the environment, or what we don't know about it and what it does to the environment, and just put it out there. So once we decided on that, the rest was easy, because sewage is essentially my natural habitat, thanks to the book. I've spent the last few years digging through it, um, researching various novel solutions to the humans' oldest problem, keeping themselves free from their own excrement. So I had the right sources and the right data and the right studies, and then it was kind of easy. You take a chemical that's in sewage, you research, you know, where it comes from, what it does, and what we don't know about what it does, and what experts think of it, and why it shouldn't be there, and how we can maybe do things differently. So in this case, reporting was easy. It's the best format in which we can tell the best story, was the tricky thing to decide.
Yeah, so in the piece you list caffeine, like you said, I believe there's mercury, antibiotics. When you were writing it, what struck you as the most alarming data you were finding some of these?
Well, some of this data that I was working with, I kind of knew, that the data and the numbers were alarming. But in some ways, when I started on the story, I didn't think that anything could surprise me about sewage after all these years. But I did find some new and not so exciting, but concerning tidbits. Caffeine was one. Like it's the most innocuous of all the drugs. Like the only one vice I have. It turns out it can inhibit growth in some species, impair reproductions in others, and cause skeletal deformations in thirds. And it's like, Jesus, I feel guilty drinking my tea. And I think the other one was, pardon my vocabulary, is that human shit can directly kill coral. Like it's not just by pollution, but like directly. So here's the thing that I thought was completely fascinating. So we worry about zoonotic diseases spilling into us, but we're quite literally spilling out human pathogens onto corals when we either don't sufficiently treat sewage or when we have storm overflows. So there's this bug called Serratia um, marcescens, which can give humans diarrhea as well as urinary and respiratory infections. But in the ocean, and particularly in Florida Keys, um, that bug gives coral the so-called white pox disease that produces patches of dead white tissue. And so one study found that in Florida Keys, the Elkhorn coral is so badly affected that it loses like 2.5 centimeters of its surface a day, and about 70% of it is lost already. So here's your reverse zoonosis. We never even thought about it, but apparently our bug is now killing coral. That's pretty bad.
That's that is something that's worrying. Yeah, and so talking about human shit, that was obviously the center of your recent book. Give us a brief synopsis of trying to get across the book, and perhaps you can interest some of our viewers now to go check it out.
Sure. So Uh, the book is about the novel solutions to the world's oldest problem. Our humans' oldest problem, keeping ourselves free from our excrement. It is probably the oldest problem, because before we settled down and started farming, it was not a problem. People would just go wherever they went, into whatever bush they felt like, and walked away from it. And once we settled and started farming, we could no longer walk away from our shit. And sure enough, shit began to pile up, and still piling up. Um, and so since we became stationary, it became a real problem. So in the book, I sort of talk about the history of how humans dealt with their waste. Not every society hated it. Some societies really were like really incredibly awesome at how they found uses for it and couldn't even live without it. Mostly they used it in agriculture, put it back into soil and grew food with it. And it was such a massively hot commodity in some societies in China and Japan that people bought it and sold it and traded it and stole it. So that's like the historical part of the book, and all of that is true. And then I have a more modern part of the book where I talk about what we can do today in different societies, in more developed Western societies, and in societies that don't have centralized sanitation systems, and even can't build them because they either don't have enough water, or have too much water. Too much water doesn't work either because you're just going to have spills all the time. There's some really interesting, very, very, very smart and you know frugal solutions in the sense that they take this substance that nobody wants and they convert it into electricity, fertilizer, and even crude oil, and even medicine. So that's the gist of the book.
Did you find that there were any correlations in the societies that really did have an interest in using their excrement positively and their ability to transport, like with the advanced sewage systems? So did those things go together?
Uh, Not quite. They just had a completely different look at what it is. I mean, they didn't build advanced sewage systems. They found just like very smart ways of taking shit out of the cities and bringing it to the countryside in various ways, mostly by sailing and like small boats, with containers, full of it, and just being super organized. In terms of its collection, they had, you know, people who worked in that industry had a way, like they had their routes around the city. Everybody had their own personal route where they would go every single morning. They would get it up, pile it up into containers and onto carts and take it to the port, load it up onto like the barges or the little gondolas and sail it off, and then like dry it, sort it, sell it. It was like, I mean, the operation was like absolutely amazing. Yeah.
What was what was your inspiration or the impetus to start researching and writing a book about that?
That actually comes from my childhood. I've had a fairly unconventional upbringing. I grew up on my grandfather's farm, um, and my grandfather had two degrees, one in engineering, aerospace engineering, and one in agriculture. I think he kind of combined all the knowledge he had on both. So he fertilized our family farm with the content of our septic system, and every fall he would put on like these like heavy overalls, boots, gloves, like it's like kind of like this special clothing for this operation. Open the septic tank and use two big buckets to take all of this stuff out, and not just pour it onto the land, but put it into compost pits together with like the kitchen scraps and dead leaves and dead plants, and then he would cover up the pit and let it sit for 3 years, and and so that would all whatever was inside fermented entirely and became compost. And when he would open it again 3 years later in the spring, none of it. None of the original stuff was there. It was just dirt, like rich black dirt that smelled so good. It smelled like a forest floor. It smelled of the promise of the next harvest. And it was so fertile that plants just popped out of it and grew like crazy. And that's in the pretty abysmal Russian summers that were short and rainy and cold. He I don't know where he learned that system. I wouldn't be surprised if it actually came from the East, from China, for example. But he definitely had that system down pat.
Had he ever been to China? I mean, that was my next question. Like, was this a practice that was passed down from in your family? Or did you have a long history of farmers in your family that sort of just knew? Maybe they didn't know how this worked exactly, but just knew that if you put these together, then you would have great agriculture.
Yeah, I think he knew. I think it was a practice that was passed down. I knew that he never been to China, but I think it was something that was passed down. I wouldn't say that everybody knew how to do it. So people, farmers generally composted. People who lived, around us composted things like, leaves and dead plants and kitchen scraps. But and cow manure. Cow manure was definitely everybody used it, but to use human shit, that was kind of special. Not too many people did it. But apparently, at least, from what my grandfather always said, it was even better than cow manure. And here's why. So humans have richer diets than cows, for example, who eat just, grass and plants. And so our poop is more nutritious compared to the poop of animals who don't eat other substances other than grass. And so it's a better fertilizer, and I think he was right because of everything I saw. Yeah.
Do you know of any movements on a global scale or in other countries that are taking advantage of this use of human excrement, particularly to better fertilize our farms?
Um, yeah, definitely. In like the past 10 years, there's definitely a movement. It started around 2011. It started when Bill Gates and his foundation issued that Reinvent the Toilet Challenge, where they wanted scientists to design a toilet that could work in kind of like resource poor conditions, that wouldn't use a lot of water or didn't use any water at all, or could convert its output into something useful: fertilizer, energy, electricity, something. And a lot of scientists kind of like jumped on the bandwagon and tried to reinvent the toilet, and they did. And as that movement sort of caught up and started, more and more people became interested in it, different ways of doing it started becoming available. And so right now, if you look like across the globe, there are multiple efforts and multiple technologies that are doing this, and on different scales. Like if for example, there's some companies that I wrote about in the book that, one was in Madagascar. So they do this manual collection and they take it into their biodigester where they essentially compost it and convert it into fertilizer and biogas, which they burn to create electricity. Like the burner that spins the turbines, the output is electricity. There is another company in Kenya that has a different technology that converts poop into burnable briquettes. It's like a form of charcoal, and that sort of kills, um, two birds with one stone. It, obviously rids people of their poo, and it also decreases deforestation because people don't have to cut trees to make charcoal. There are some interesting developments here in North America, where multiple companies came up with multiple forms of converting sewage into fertilizer. One of them is in Canada. It's called Listic, and they sort of like they take the poo, they whip it into a inside a blender into what they call a sewage milkshake, and that blade is so sharp that it kills all the pathogens. Like it cuts through all the bacterial cells as it does it. So the resulting, you know, mass is actually safe to put in the fills, and that's what they do with it. There is another. The Washington D.C. wastewater treatment plant, DC Water, is my favorite because they what they ultimately create is something that you and I can buy and use in our garden today. They cook sludge in this massive pressure cookers. So by the time it's done, there's nothing left to life in it. Then it goes into this massive digester tanks where different bacteria chew through it, and they convert it into essentially compost and biogas. And then that compost is it's dewatered, dried, and packed into bags, and it's called Bloom. And like I said, you and I can go buy it and grow food with it if we want. It's grade A certified, which means it's safe to grow food with. And then there was recently another really cool player that sort of came um, online, and they're now in San Francisco, and they are trying something at a level of a building where they sort of like insert their system right before all this wastewater lives the building, and rather than going into a treatment plant, so they capture that water, they clean it, they reroute it back into the building as a gray water, which you can wash with, shower with, water plants with, just use it for laundry, just not drink it. um, and the rest they sort of take out and use their own proprietary process to treat it, and they're discussing with the city of San Francisco about using it in the city parks. So those are my current favorites, and I'm kind of excited to see what else is going to come. It's definitely a very burgeoning and fertile field right now.
That's super cool. I'm a little curious about why they say not to drink it, but it's okay to shower with. I mean, I don't know. That seemed a
Yeah,
dubious proposition.
that's a little bit. It is a little bit of a devious proposition, but I mean, like most people don't drink water, when they shower. It's
Yeah,
a good question to ask them the next time I talk to them.
yeah.
Yeah.
So offline, you mentioned that you were busy working on book two. Do you want to share a little bit
Yeah.
about what that'll be about?
Yes, that book two is about alternatives to antibiotics. Um, and that's probably all I'm going to say, um, because it's still in the works. And yeah, it's almost like an unborn child. I don't want to talk about it quite yet. Let it
Do
get to the
you want
finish line.
to at least say why we might need an alternative to antibiotics? What's wrong with
Antibiotics. Oh,
antibiotics?
oh, well, most certainly. Well, we are running out of antibiotics very quickly, because the superbugs are like popping up here and there, and part of it is because we used and overused antibiotics too much. But part of it's evolution. If we're gonna have a new antibiotic, eventually some bug somewhere will develop resistance to it, and we're gonna need a new one. And we haven't really been developing new antibiotics for a while. And there are many reasons as to why. Part of it is very expensive, and when once you have it, you don't know how quickly it will become obsolete. It might be good for 30 years, but it might be good for 5. So it's not it's kind of a gamble that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are not willing to take or are afraid to take. So we need alternatives. We either need new antibiotics, or we need just completely different ways of treating bacterial infections. And so my book is actually about a completely different alternative.
Fascinating. Lina, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online and where they can reach out to you or check out what new stuff you got coming on the way?
Sure. So they can find me on linazeldovich.com. It's a pretty simple site. They can find my book on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Goodreads, so pretty much anywhere where books are sold. If they Google me, they're probably going to find a few podcasts where I talk more shit online, in various funny ways. It's one of my favorite things to do. Um, and they can also email me at the other dark matter, at gmail.com.
Awesome. Lena, thanks so much for your time. It's always a discussion
It was
with
fun
you
being
about
here. Okay.